excited. And now we're going to Malaysia. But maybe not the parts of Malaysia you're familiar with. We're going to East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, on the island of Borneo. Professor James Chin grew up in Sarawak, and he's now the director of the Asia Institute, Tasmania, which is at the University of Tasmania. He studies governance issues in Southeast Asia, in particular in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. So when I saw his article, Is Malaysia Heading for Borneo Exit? Why some in East Malaysia are advocating for secession, I wanted to find out more. I began by asking James Chin to tell me about Sabah and Sarawak.
There are many reasons why Sabah and Sarawak are much more interesting, and I'll just give you a small flavor. They have a totally different history compared to Peninsular Malaysia. Sabah used to be called North Borneo. For more than 100 years, it was run and administered by a private British company called the North Borneo Chartered Company, a very similar company to East India Company, so basically the same thing. And on the Sarawak side, it was ruled for exactly 100 years by a private British family called the Brookes. In popular literature, they're called the White Rajas. So the British really only came in to colonize these two states after the end of the Second World War. In the case of North Borneo or Sabah, the company was in no position to rebuild after the war, so they gave it to the British. And in Sarawak's case, the Raja of Sarawak did not have the money to rebuild Sarawak, so he ceded Sarawak to the British government for a special pension. So even today, the Sarawak government is still paying a small amount of pension to the White Raja. So it's really quite an interesting story.
It is an interesting story, and I read recently in an article in the South China Morning Post in which you were quoted that one of the grandchildren is visiting Sarawak again, going to create a museum, cover the history.
Yes, I think what happened is that with the advent of the social media, people are getting more and more curious about their own history and their own past.
Yeah, so two very different histories then for Sabah and for Sarawak.
And Peninsular Malaysia. But the biggest change is the demography. In Peninsular Malaysia, essentially you have three major ethnic groups: the indigenous Malays, followed by the migrants who were brought in during British colonial times, the Indians and the Chinese. But in Sabah and Sarawak, not a single ethnic group comprises more than 40% of the population. And in fact, there are altogether about 80 different ethnic subgroups in Sarawak, and probably about a similar number in Sabah. And also, there's always been a very high rate of intermarriages. So in terms of racial relations, they've actually done quite a good job. If you go to most of the small towns in Sabah and Sarawak, the church is built next to a mosque or a Buddhist temple. So this gives you an idea about, diversity and tolerance in Southeast Asia.
Let's go back to the colonial period for a moment. So Britain acquired Sabah and Sarawak, as you described, and then they were working towards Malaysia Federation. How did they go about doing that?
After the Second World War, Britain was also in economic crisis. The only country that was untouched by the war was basically the Americans. And of course, the Americans wanted to push this idea of decolonization. So when they looked at the region, they saw all these small little areas that were controlled by the British, either directly or indirectly. 5 pieces of territory: Malaya, second is Singapore, third one is Sarawak, fourth one is Brunei, and the fifth one is North Borneo. So with the typical British efficiency, they decided that we're not going to leave 5 independent states. This is the Cold War era. They're not going to survive the communist onslaught. So why don't we bring them together and create a federation so that they'll be bigger, stronger, and stop communism in its tracks? So that's exactly what they do. So after the British decided to promote this idea, they spoke to the leaders and said, would you like to be part of this larger federation that we're going to create? Initially, there were lots of opposition. A lot of these people are very loyal British subjects. So that's the reason why about 2/3 of the population said that, if the British want us to come along, we agree to this proposal. Now, this is where the controversy really starts. Historians looking back see that the British were not only pushing for this very hard, they also used the influence at the United Nations to make sure that the Federation of Malaysia was accepted as a member without much problem. Today, when you talk about the secessionist movement, one of the key arguments made was that the people back in the 60s were not properly consulted whether they wanted to be part of the Federation. Again, the sort of stuff that we see in Southeast Asia is not unique to Sabah and Sarawak. In the last 20 years, we have a very big fight for secessionists. One, of course, is the famous West Papua movement. They also said that the referendum held was not done properly. And also, we also have a long fight in terms of Aceh. They didn't get the independence because of tsunami, but they did get a high level of autonomy. In some ways, you can argue that a lot of this was due to the fact that when the colonial authorities left this region, in terms of drawing up maps and boundaries, they were usually drawn without any regard for the real situation on the ground. They drew the map according to the interests of the British and the elites rather than what was actually happening on the ground.
And now we're seeing that many people in Sabah and Sarawak feel that the Malaysian Federation has not delivered for them.
So they were promised a high level of autonomy. High level autonomy essentially means political autonomy. And also because they were far behind, they were promised that, if you join us, we will start developing you so that you will be on par with us. The people in Sabah and Sarawak feel that this has not happened. The political elites in Peninsular Malaysia are trying to export their model to Sabah and Sarawak. Their model is essentially a racial model of governance. And as I mentioned to you already, you can't do that because the demography and history are very different.
Do you describe in the paper a toxic racial and religious politics in Malaysia? So what is it?
There's a lot of tensions between the Muslim people and non-Muslim people, because the Muslim people regard Malaysia as an Islamic state, so they want to impose Muslim rules on the population. The politics in Peninsular Malaysia is all based about Malay versus non-Malays. But if you go to Sabah and Sarawak, although those elements exist, they're not as sharp. So the simplest way of understanding this is that, if you go to an eatery shop in Peninsular Malaysia, you find that it's highly divided. If you go to a restaurant, everything will be halal. If you go to Sabah and Sarawak, you find that you can serve halal and non-halal food at the same place. So that's an example of where you have a much, much higher level of tolerance. If you go to Sabah, there are many cases where in a single family, you got Muslim, Christians, Catholics in the same family, and they come together during the religious celebrations. So I think those are some of the really, really positive things that we can learn from Sabah and Sarawak.
I'm speaking with James Chin, and we've been talking about why some people in Sabah and Sarawak in East Malaysia are advocating for secession from the Federation of Malaysia. Sabah is one of the poorest states in Malaysia, and the infrastructure in both Sabah and Sarawak is vastly underdeveloped compared with Peninsular Malaysia. Yet, more than half of Malaysia's oil and gas production comes from Sabah and Sarawak. So, what's going on? Well, in 1974, Malaysia enacted the Petronas Law, in which everything related to oil and gas is owned by the federal government. Only 5% of the income goes back to Sabah and Sarawak. Here's James Chin again.
So you can imagine, right, a person from Sabah and Sarawak, the moment they land in Kuala Lumpur, they see this shiny new international airport, that highway that goes all the way from Johor Bahru all the way to Penang, and they begin to wonder, where is all this money coming from? Even today, there is no highway linking Kuching to Kota Kinabalu. So you can imagine it. They just started the project 2 years ago, and it's not due for completion until 2023 to 2025. In many parts of interior Sarawak, and I'm speaking from personal experience, many of the long houses there do not have proper electricity. They still rely on generators. In rural Sabah, there's no clean water, no electricity, and of course, no internet. Why should a child live in the interior of Sarawak? Why should he have the same online opportunity compared to a child living in rural Malaya?
Yes, for sure. There was an election in Sabah, a state election, and do we know what the results were yet?
Yes, the results was essentially split. Both sides got about 46% of the vote. Every politician said that they are state nationalists. The results of the elections in Sabah suggest that state nationalism is on the way out because both sides claim that they can deliver on autonomy and economic development. On that issue, there was no differences. The big differences was that one side was saying that, you should vote for us because the other side can't be trusted. Even though they claim to be state nationalists, they've been manipulated by Malaya. So it seems that because both sides receive about the same amount of votes, you can argue that, the people are just confused.
It sounds to me that there's no immediate threat of secession.
If you look at experience in the region, this sort of thing takes many years to brew. What is happening on the ground now is because of social media. Those people who wants to get out of Malaysia are using social media to educate the public about how the Federation has not delivered. Perhaps we should not give it another chance. We really have to get out and be independent because we've got oil and gas. We can join it with Brunei or whatever. The thing I fear the most is that the Malaysian government may overreact and try to use the security apparatus. You have to remember, in many parts of Southeast Asia, right, if there's a problem, a lot of those elites always think that, security is the way forward. When you and I both know that if you want lasting solution, in almost all cases, it has to be political. I mean, a policeman or a soldier can't look into what your heart is thinking. The Malaysian government essentially have two choices. One is to deal with this at a political level and resolve these historical differences. Secondly, if they play the wait and see game, that might be too late. We saw how the Indonesian government tried to suppress the East Timorese many, many years. It didn't work. And the East Timorese got the independence because I think the world has changed. The idea that you can lord over a group of people just because somehow you're superior, I think those days are gone.
Professor James Chin, Director of the Asia Institute Tasmania at the University of Tasmania. And he concludes his paper with the following statement. At the very least, what is happening on the ground in East Malaysia suggests the decolonization process in Southeast Asia is not yet complete. This colonial legacy is not only history, but is clearly reflected in the present reality. And so true, as we can see, by the independence movements throughout Southeast Asia.